Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark Skorka, President of Opera America. I hope you're well, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the opening session of Opera Conference 2020, our 50th. It's a virtual experience. Our wise board member, L. Michelle Smith, advised us to be authentic in Zoom. We join you from our homes, and despite our considerable rehearsal, hope you'll forgive us for this first event of this scale in our history. We may have a few glitches, but hope it'll all go well. We have over 2,000 people signed up to join us, dwarfing any previous Opera America convening. This week, the staff would have arrived in Seattle on Sunday and Monday to prepare registration materials, organize all the shipments from exhibitors, and test out local restaurants on your behalf. You would have arrived yesterday and this morning. For some of you, it would be your first time visit to a city at the center of 21st century technical innovation. For everyone, it would have been a welcome chance to see longstanding colleagues and meet new friends. We find ourselves gathered via Zoom. On one hand, we're apart. On the other hand, we've never been as connected as we've become over the last 8 weeks of video conferences and webinars. Let's not lose this level of connection and exchange, even as we look forward to getting together in person again as soon as possible. Let's also remember that the last century has been punctuated by profound interruptions in our lives. World War I and the Spanish flu were followed by Puccini premieres. The Great Depression and World War II were followed by the resurgence of opera in Europe and the establishment of a North American opera infrastructure. 9/11 was followed by the flowering of an American opera repertoire. And don't forget that the invention of opera itself followed the plague in Florence. We are and should be profoundly concerned about the course of COVID, but we should also look ahead to our role in shaping the next wave of opera's progress as the deepest expression of human emotions. Our founder, Glynn Ross, would have insisted that we keep moving forward. Glynn was born in 1914 in Omaha. When he graduated from high school, he managed his family's farm for 5 years. After his father's death, his mother encouraged him to pursue his dream of a career in theater. Glynn, like so many of his great generation, served in the Army during World War II. He was wounded in North Africa and was sent back to Italy by the Army, where he operated a rest camp for soldiers. Especially relevant to us today, he was one of the first patients ever to be treated with penicillin, which was still in the test phase at that time. Even then, he was irrepressible. During his time in Italy, he staged operas in Naples for the entertainment of US troops. In 1948, Gaetano Merola hired him as a stage director for the San Francisco Opera. During the 1950s, Glynn staged operas for various companies in the US, but in 1959, he moved back to Italy, where he became the first American to stage an opera for the San Carlo Theater in Naples. In 1964, Glynn moved to Seattle to lead a new company. With the Seattle Opera, he gained notice for his promotional efforts, earning the label the P.T. Barnum of opera. He used skywriting and bumper stickers and slogans like La Bohème, 6 old-time hippies in Paris, Romeo and Juliet, 2 kids in trouble, real trouble with their families, and my favorite, Get Ahead with Salome. Glynn was not a man to shy away from new works or challenging ones. In 1971, the Seattle Opera staged Tommy by The Who, with Bette Midler in a starring role. But it was in 1975 that he oversaw Seattle Opera's production of the Ring Cycle, making Seattle Opera the first American company other than the Met to produce the Ring in its entirety during a single week. He joined Arizona Opera as general director in 1983, where he oversaw the production of 2 Ring Cycles as summer festivals in Flagstaff. We honored Glynn at our 25th anniversary in 1995. He retired from Arizona Opera in 1998 and passed away in 2005 at the age of 81. In 1970, Glynn founded Opera America. The first meeting in January of 1970 took place in conjunction with the world premiere of Carlisle Floyd's masterpiece of Mice and Men. His goal was to help companies share resources. He was a practical man. Glynn realized companies were duplicating efforts, including building sets and costumes and storing them for future use. He asked, wasn't there a way to exchange, borrow, purchase, or rent these from company to company? Creating such a platform, a directory, was the impetus behind the formation of Opera America, and co-production became an early focus of the organization. But Glynn Ross was also a visionary. When you enter the new Seattle Opera Center, in the lobby is a bright wall emblazoned with a 5-line statement from Glynn from 1969 about the responsibility of all of us who are engaged in the creation, production, and enjoyment of opera. We'll hear from a group of today's opera leaders to examine that statement and its meaning for us now. In alphabetical order, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce David Gockley, the retired General Director of Houston Grand Opera and San Francisco Opera; Peggy Kriha, noted singer now serving as General Director of Opera Columbus; Jimmy López, a wonderful composer whose opera Bel Canto premiered at Lyric Opera of Chicago at the end of 2015; Nadege Souvenir, a trustee of Minnesota Opera and the soon-to-be chair of the company board; Tazewell Thompson, a stage director and librettist of the opera Blue that had a tremendously successful premiere at Glimmerglass Festival last season; and Francesca Zambello, international stage director and artistic and general director of the Glimmerglass Festival and artistic director of Washington National Opera. Welcome to all of you. In the course of our time together over the next hour, members of the audience are welcome to use our chat box or Q&A for questions or comments. We'll be reviewing them, and I'll reappear on screen from time to time to ask them on your behalf. Our facilitator for the session is Opera America's longtime friend and colleague, Ann Meier-Baker. She's Director of Music and Opera at the National Endowment for the Arts. And Ann, so happy to have you here today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this session. I'm really glad to be here. I want to start by congratulating Opera America on your 50th anniversary, which is quite a milestone. I've admired the important work of Opera America from different perspectives over the years. Prior to my arts endowment role, I held leadership roles at sister service organizations. And I want to thank you not only for your work on behalf of the opera field, but for being such a good role model for all of the performing arts and beyond. So to state the obvious, these are challenging times, but it strikes me that the times were challenging when Opera America was founded too. It was in 1969 when Glynn Ross made this visionary statement that Mark just mentioned for the opera field. He said this: "We are not just custodians of the old order. We are not curators of establishment art. We must be oriented towards the future. It's our business to improve the quality of life. And we had better become positive and not just stand by." When Glynn Ross made that visionary statement, we were still reeling from the assassination of Martin Luther King. Young people were being drafted to fight the Vietnam War, and we landed a man on the moon. Then and now, in good times and bad, it's comforting to have the first-rate service organization of Opera America to help guide the opera field. So our assignment today is to move out of the tyranny of the moment and to reflect about what opera can mean going forward. And we're going to use Glynn Ross's statement as a springboard for today's discussion. Each of our panelists has chosen a few phrases that speak particularly to them, and they'll share their thoughts with us about each of these. I'd like to start with David Gockley to share your first selected phrase. David?
First of all, hello to all of you. I have been out of the business now almost 4 years, and I miss all of you and wish I could get to know the many, many new people who are a part of our profession that were unknown to me at the time. Looking at these 5 statements, to a certain extent, I found out that I did not necessarily agree with one above the others. To a certain extent, I agree with all of them, but I guess my favorite one is we must be oriented towards the future. I would put it differently. Glynn and I often did not agree on everything. Rather say, we as a profession must grow and diversify the audience with visionary work, but not to be so extreme that you kill the goose that lays the golden egg. One must progress, move forward, capture new audiences, but not be so extreme that you lose the audiences you have. It's a pragmatic point, for sure, but one to first survive. We got to first survive in order to progress. I also am celebrating my 50th anniversary beginning work in opera. In 1970, I joined the staff of Houston Grand Opera, having tried for 6 years to be an opera singer, and put that aside when my voice teacher at that time, Margaret Harshaw, said, I think you better, what did she say? You better take a break from this, a very long break. So I was living in New York at that time with my wife, Patricia Wise, who was a soprano, hell of a lot more successful than I was. And I had the chance to go to the New York City Opera and see the work of Frank Corsaro. I had spent 3 summers as an apprentice at Santa Fe Opera and got to know opera the way Santa Fe produced it in that gorgeous theater up on the high desert in New Mexico. What else? I was, of course, aware of Seattle Opera. Glynn got a lot of publicity, not only for his work, but his style, as Mark read to us. There was also the Center Opera Company of Minnesota that performed in the Guthrie Theater. And each of these 4 companies had aspects that I saw as being successful and that formulated my approach to running an opera company was when I was named general director of Houston Grand Opera in 1972. First thing I noticed was the way you get noticed is you commission operas. And
And
that's the
commission
way.
you did. And commission you did.
And commission I did, and I remember when Of Mice and Men was premiered at Seattle. It received a very good review in the New York Times, and people in Houston would come up to me and say, "Oh gosh, that must be quite a company, because look, the greatest newspaper in the country is reviewing it." So the first thing, and also let me drop back a little, opera was, there were 20 or so companies, and they were run by people whose last names were Fabiani, De Filippi, Kruger, Karp, Herbert, although that was not his real name, he anglicized it, Merilla in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
So this was largely an immigrant art form, and the people who were there, often the immigrants, directors and professionals, got together with high society people in a community, and that was, together they created a company. And there was not a lot of difference between the companies. Many of them used the same stage directors. Many of them used the same sets, which they rented from a warehouse in New Jersey that was run by a guy by the name of Anthony Stevenello. And the term instant opera grew out of that, because the singers came into town on a Sunday. They did their staging rehearsals. They had a piano dress, an orchestra dress, and opened maybe after a day off, maybe not. But it was a very quick and, I'm not going to say quick and dirty operation. But
okay, I'm going to stop you there, David, and vote for, we have one vote for not getting rid of a goose that's going to lay the golden egg. Excuse me, 1 minute. Okay, can I move on to Peggy? Which of the statements spoke to you? Oops, you're muted.
Okay, I think, am I still?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me be part of the conversation. It's really humbling to hear David talk about a history of such a great industry. And I love this quote. As I was reading through it, I was stopped in my tracks after the first line. So that's what I'm going to focus on. We are not custodians of the old order. And bear with me, because when I first started thinking about this line, I geeked out a little bit, looked up some words, custodian and guardian. And as I was reading the definition, I replaced the pronouns with the word opera, so I could get an impact of how this line affects my industry. So I'm going to read it for you, this new definition. A custodian is one that holds operas for safekeeping in order to minimize the risk or loss. A guardian is a person who looks after and is legally responsible for opera, which is unable to manage its own affairs, especially an incompetent or disabled opera, or an opera whose composer has died. So in reading this definition out loud, it just was so clear to me how ludicrous and arrogant I would be to claim to be a custodian or a guardian of what I believe is the most important art form in the world. and that it has managed through time and cultures and pandemics and world events, and that it does just fine. The opera is glorious, and for most people that encounter it, it stays glorious to them for the rest of their lives. And so therefore, I feel very free to trust the talents and the ideas to advance opera forward, to give young directors and young conductors a platform with all the wonders of an opera house to display their ideas and their convictions and their art. And I feel at times that it's okay to plan for a little lower donation at times, or a little smaller audience at times, in order for an opera company to be relevant in a community and to be inclusive for everyone. So opera can be for everyone. So finding inclusivity in all the ways that an opera company can. And I also think it opens a door for new audiences that need that new door to feel comfortable to walk through. So I think that these new approaches and these new ideas from these so energetic and creative and somewhat controversial at times creators of today, that it's important to allow them to define who is on our board and who our artists will be, what kind of artistic decisions and financial decisions we make as an opera company, that they are worth the risk, they are worth the investment, and I feel opera is in very good hands going forward. And although we respect the old order and we honor it, which is right and we should, but our creativity should not be suppressed in order for us to preserve it. And those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much. So much richness there to think about. I want to move on to Jimmy. From the composer's point of view, what did you think about this statement? And what did you choose?
Hello, can you hear me well? Excellent. Well, thank you. I think it's, when I read the whole statement, I felt that it went beyond my wildest dreams in terms of what it will come from someone who leads an opera companies. And it was surprising in how bold and somewhat radical it was. But I did connect strongly with it, especially with the very first line as well, which reads, "We are not custodians of the old order." Now I have perhaps a slightly different approach or other reasons why this particular statement hit home. And in my case, I feel that as a composer, well, my whole existence is kind of a statement of creating new work, of really moving on to the future and not necessarily having to rely so much on the past. I mean, for sure, as a composer, I have had to study the works of the past, and I have had to learn the techniques and, you know, studies of harmony and counterpoint and orchestration and all that. And as my teacher in Peru used to say, you'd better study all that so you don't have to end up discovering gunpowder all over again. You know, it's like those basic inventions like the wheel and so forth, those are known. You don't have to go back there. What you have to do is take all that knowledge and build upon it. So yes, there has to be a respect for tradition, and we have to honor it, but we also have to build upon it and sometimes break free from it. And knowledge allows us to break free from things as well. And I was thinking about our recent times. I mean, since documentation in terms of video and audio has been available, I feel that that also has the power to free us, because in olden times, we wouldn't be able to see an opera unless it was staged. Nowadays, we have that luxury of having this immense library of works that have already been documented. So in that sense, And even though live theater cannot be replaced by anything or any technological means so far, I will argue that perhaps having those works documented, does free us to pursue new work. I know that my co-panelists are very like-minded because of their track record and their commitment to new work. So in a way, it feels like an echo chamber of sorts. I wish more people felt this way. But as a composer, I feel that there's a large quantity of untapped brain power, that it remains idle due to lack of opportunity. I feel there's a large amount of composers and librettists and stage directors and everyone who is involved in this industry who is ready to commit to new work. But we do have to compete with Puccini and Beethoven and Mozart, which is not easy in a way. The one opera I've written, and I've been lucky to write an opera at a very, very large scale, was reviewed by many outlets. And in one of them, I remember Alex Ross in the New Yorker saying that in a healthier musical culture, López will now be on his 4th or 5th opera. And I felt, yeah, actually, that is true. So it does, and the word healthier kind of stuck with me because it implied that we are not living in a healthy musical culture or healthy enough. How do we bring it up to speed? How do we help it be healthier? And that has to do a lot with creating new work that is alive. And not only that, so that our artists, contemporary artists, those who live now and create now, have the chance to create and pass through this earth and leave a legacy. I was thinking, how many operas would Mozart have written had he been born in the United States around this time? Perhaps he would have stopped at Idomeneo. I don't know, but it would be really a pity. We will really want to see more of what his brain could do. When I think of Broadway, for example, by comparison, it's a much healthier industry right now. Of course, it's much more recent, much more commercial oriented. But I was thinking like a classic, like The Sound of Music, for example, it was premiered in 1959, feels like extremely old, whereas it was premiered the same year that the Voix Humaine from Poulenc was written, and Britain's Midsummer Night's Dream was premiered back then. So in terms of the history and the centuries that our art form goes back to, we do have an enormous legacy to appreciate. And we have, of course, all of that heritage that we need to cultivate. But, and going back to the statement, we are not supposed to be custodians of it. We don't necessarily have to assume that role. I think the best way to honor opera and to honor creation is by actually creating more. Because once you create new work, then people will be attracted to the art form. And then they will dig into the history of the art form itself. I've been seeing many opera companies turn, for example, into smaller work, production of smaller work in smaller theaters that are not part of the main stage. I think that has had a wonderful effect in revitalizing chamber opera and contemporary opera. But on the other hand, I will want us not to lose our sight of large-scale opera, because I think that opera at its grandest, it cannot be matched by any other art form. Who is commissioning the next Ring cycle? I know that the Ring cycle wasn't commissioned per se, but it will be wonderful to think at that scale, to think of in those grand terms, because I think those are the ones that, at least in my case, the first made me fall in love with opera. It was the sheer scale and the massive sound and the amount of brain power involved and the talents combined. That was what attracted me in the first place to opera.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jimmy. So we've heard about the healthier musical culture. We've heard about finding many ways to be inclusive and visionary work. I want to move on now to Nadege. So you have a different role that you'll be starting in July. And I'm curious, from your point of view, as an incoming board chair during challenging times, which of these statements spoke to you?
Yeah, and thank you. And again, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of, this esteemed panel and give the opportunity to share my perspective here, not as an artist, but as a trustee. And this statement, the collective statement, was really powerful to me. As Jimmy pointed out, it was a little bit radical. Like right now in this moment, there is still some radical concepts in this statement. And when I read it, I really thought about it from a couple of perspectives. In my day job, I work at a community foundation, and right now with COVID-19, what we're seeing is a real focus on basic needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs sort of fills my brain as I think about how we all show up as individuals. So the line that really stood out for me was, "It is our business to improve the quality of life." And what does that mean right now? Because we're not talking about creative pursuits and arts for art's sake when there are people who are trying to figure out their housing, who have maybe just been furloughed or laid off from a job, who are suffering sort of outsized medical impacts as it relates to this, be it because of COVID or the derivative effects of equity in our society. And how can opera at this time be a part of improving the quality of life when quality and life right now are a very different thing than they were even 6 months ago? And how can opera help us kind of stay connected in such a time of disconnection? And I really think the arts sort of collectively are challenged right now, across the field. I see friends and colleagues sort of sharing the challenges that are happening. And that breaks my heart personally as a fan, but also because it's like we're forgetting the sort of fundamental nature of arts, of opera. This is a creative sector. This is a sector that has sort of the ability to connect thoughts and ideas in different and unusual ways. And why isn't that collective brain trust being sort of funneled into our social good and the way that we show up in community? And so I'm really proud when I think about some of the things that the Minnesota Opera has done in the last couple of months to try to find ways to be connected, because the reality is, as other folks, as folks are thinking about their basic needs, sometimes it's hard to remember those things that you love. And how can we be something people love and something people maybe need at this time? And one of the things we did right away as an organization, Ryan Taylor, our president and general director, reached out to health organizations, and we ended up partnering with health partners. And our costume staff, our artisans, worked to make masks to provide one of those basic critical needs right now, to use the talents and the skills that they have from this field. And we've ultimately, I think at this point, we've made between those sewers over 10,000 masks that have gone out into the community. And the reality is, some of those masks have touched people who have never sort of thought about opera, but recognizing perhaps where, who provided them might open a new door in a time when we're, to meet again, to be together in person. One of the other things that is, I think, really missing right now is connectivity. These remote meetings are fantastic, but the act of going to the opera together, to convening in a space, to hearing the voices of others is missing. And we can't repeat that. We can't model that exactly, but where are other opportunities that we can connect with folks? And I know from feedback from donors and subscribers that when Minnesota Opera was really thinking about what to do, when it had to make the difficult decision about its season, just like every other company did, I received lots of emails from companies about that. Minnesota Opera actually called everyone. A recorded phone call from Ryan Taylor, sort of talking through what was happening. And it seems silly, but it was such a delight to hear a voice tell the story of the moment, the decision being made now, and sort of what you can expect in the future. And I just think that this field is full of storytellers, is full of voice and full of connections. And where are those opportunities that might seem mundane, right? A recorded robocall is not an artistic pursuit by any sort of means of the spectrum, but it felt real and it hit people in the heart, which is what this work does. And then really thinking about when you think about the needs, it's the individual artists are particularly challenged at this time, right? They work contract to contract. Their quality of life and their challenges are very similar to sort of the general population, but we cancel a show, and that's what they were looking towards in the weeks to come, and really appreciated many companies as well as Minnesota Opera finding ways to continue to honor the contracts at least in this year, because that's a way to speak to the individuals and their needs, and to think about ways to continue to keep and make those connections, because one day we will be on the other side of this. And who will you remember held your hand along that way? Who will you remember reached out and sang you a song or told you a story, or made you feel warm in your heart? And I do think that opera has the tools and the techniques and the spaces and opportunities to do that. And I just encourage us all in our capacity to sort of to effectuate some of those contacts, to be that voice, to show up where we can and where it reasonably makes sense, because that's powerful. It creates hope. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but I've had those days during this time where I wanted to shut off all the screens and ignore everyone. Hope is what gets you to the next day, that gets you to the next thing, that gets us all eventually on the other side of this. Again, looking at these new works that Jimmy mentioned, getting to see the classic productions we long to see on stage. We will get there, but it may take longer than we'd like. And in the interim, how can we stay connected while this is happening?
Thank you so much. This line that you chose speaks to me as well. And the idea that opera can meet unmet community needs is really great. Tazewell, you're by phone. Can you share with us which line you chose? Let's see, we might be on mute. You might need to unmute us. Okay, well, let me skip and come back then. Francesca, do you mind sharing your thoughts with us?
Happy to. First of all, I just want to say hello to everybody here, to colleagues. I see here new colleagues, and to everyone who's out there listening, old and new friends. It's a great forum, what a great task to be given these words by Glynn Ross, who I knew peripherally and was really a visionary in his own right, and who started so many things that we take for granted today. So I'm grateful to be part of this. For me, my favorite is, it is our business to improve the quality of life. But just to look back for 1 second, I don't think that being a custodian of the old is in conflict with being oriented to the future. My basic beliefs about opera are that like Jimmy mentioned, it's the glory of the human voice, it's the orchestra, it's the incredible sound. And then all of the stories that we get to tell, the power of the stories, and ultimately the way that all of those stories create tribes, they create communities, they create a connection. And those things for me are at the center of this art form. And for Glimmerglass and for Washington, I have really tried to use the power of story and song to build community in so many different ways. And which is why that saying about it's our business to improve the quality of life really resonates with me. I believe that we're in an art form that has a great possibility to speak to social issues and is responsible about what we produce. And that doesn't mean that everything has to have the power of certain contemporary works. we can still speak to people in meaningful ways when we're doing La Boheme and Aida. It's just, again, finding ways of connecting. And that's why I find that being able in both of these companies to bring the power of song and music, whether it's to an audience or to incarcerated people at Attica, or to creating new works for kids, or to bring community members together around challenging topics. And I think when I think of improving the quality of life, obviously right now, the last few months, our lives are upside down, but I never would have thought that here, and I'm upstate now at Glimmerglass, that our opera company would have responded so quickly. Same thing, making masks by the thousands. We have been making, in our scene shop, bird houses for families with kids at home. We have sent some of our staff members who are emergency services professionals, because they've had training because we're in a rural ground. They're working in New York City now. We have been doing, trying to take care of everybody who was supposed to come work here this summer by paying them something. So I think that now the whole notion of improving the quality of life is what we can use arts for in so many different ways. And I think that right now, of course, we're wrapped up in how do we do this digitally? And of course we want to gather, we want to be with our people. But we're going to have to work through the digital and find a way to make it feel human and that we are connected, because I know we yearn for that. And so I believe that this art form, more than any, can get people out of silos and into community. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And as the beneficiary of much of your work in Washington, I really appreciate all that you've done. Let's see, Tazewell, can we hear you now? Taz? Do my friends at Opera America have any magic wands to wave at this point? Let me just...
No, and we're just not able to hear Taz, unfortunately.
Okay.
I've received a whole lot of questions that have come in over the chat box while everyone has been speaking, and speaking so wonderfully well. And I have a few questions for specific people, but just a note that next Wednesday, our session at 2 o'clock will be about digital media, social media. So there are a number of questions about what companies are doing right now to communicate and to build relationships with their stakeholders through digital media. And there are questions too about how can we use digital media to not only transmit art, but also to create art for that new platform. Again, a lot of that's going to be discussed in next week's meeting. So I will sidestep that just for now for a little bit. But in terms of connecting with audiences now, Cheska, you have occasionally the enviable position of running 2 companies as artistic director, and now you have 2 companies that unfortunately have had to cancel seasons as artistic director here. What are you doing to make sure your companies are staying in touch with their stakeholders?
I've got good protocol. I try to always mute and unmute. In Washington, we will be shortly announcing some major programming ideas, so I hesitate to say anything. And in Glimmerglass, we are just about to announce also some things that will be our version of our summer festival online. So I think that we're all working on programming, but I hate to actually spill any beans right now because we are finessing it. And I have to say I'm fortunate in both places to have extraordinary partners and extraordinary teams who are in some ways bringing such incredible creativity to how we will communicate with our audiences. Because I think that's number one, is really how we communicate with our audience, how we stay engaged with them, and how we best serve them. And I think that's probably what we're all going to be working for. So I hate to feel like I'm not answering your question, but we're really going to be rolling out some things in the next couple of weeks. So maybe even by next Tuesday, so I could send you something by then.
We'll stay tuned.
But even to know that the digital platform is going to play a role, certainly at Glimmerglass, if not elsewhere.
Absolutely, both will be engaging in the digital platform. And I think what's important when I talk about community for all ages, whether we're doing something for the, the conoscenti or the first time goer, or for kids or families, whether it's anything from, what can I say, a graphic novel to a virtual reality. All of those things are things that we're exploring.
So the next question I have on my list from the audience is one for Jimmy. And it's sort of a question and a half. Has the crisis changed your creative voice at all? Do you feel that you want to compose with a different sensibility based on the crisis?
It's an ongoing process, because I feel that uncertainty is one of the hardest things for an artist to deal with. And when the crisis started, I was already working on a piece that I was able to finish. It was good because it allowed me to focus on something else. But once I completed that piece, I was left in a void and in this kind of in-between realities, trying to think of what is the next thing that should be done. Should I engage more online, like my colleagues were doing? My reaction so far has been to sit back and reflect on things. I am trying not to be reactive, and I'm waiting for the whole crisis to unfold, as it were, to really understand what effect it has had on me, because I feel that it is going to permanently change the landscape for all of us, and in ways that we are not yet aware. So we will have to react to that once we're out of this. I feel that we're going to leave the house and our eyes are going to meet the light, and we're going to be a little bit dazed, perhaps, but we are going to be able to rise to the challenge. We're going to collectively find all the answers. There are some artists and colleagues who have been completely unable to devote themselves to creative work because they feel that all of this is just overwhelming. Others are able to go into a creative frenzy. So I think it's a very individual process, and it affects people in different ways. We have to be sensitive not to, I think, force ourselves into doing anything that we don't feel we can at this point. This is really unprecedented, and we have to be able to react as things take place. So I think what we're doing today, for example, exchanging ideas and strategizing in ways of how, for the future, that helps. It does help me to have an anchor in the future, even if I don't know if things are going to take place, to plan things in the future, to make plans for things, for sure.
And several questions have come up, and it's in a way it's a group question, and then I'll turn it right back to you, Anne. And the question is, you talk about pointing to the future, and you talk about the importance of new work. And at Opera Columbus, you've had a recent world premiere. Cheska, you've done so many new works at Glimmerglass. Jimmy, you're a composer. David has done more new works than any of us added together between his years in San Francisco and Houston. But what is it that makes a new work successful, that will speak to an audience, that makes the audience willing to loosen the grasp on some of the inherited repertoire? What are some of the elements that make new opera work? Cheska, can I turn that one to you?
Well, most of what I learned from David Gockley about producing new works, having directed many for him at his tenure in both companies. And I realized that if we don't create an American canon, and I'm talking about starting, this is like 30 years ago, we had this, really a canon of works that people wanted to hear and that spoke our stories, that were not Eurocentric, that were about us. That to me was really the most important lesson to learn, and also one that I think speaks to us today. I mean, it doesn't have to be an opera about today, but it has to be a story that connects on some universal level to our audiences. I mean, why do we still love The Marriage of Figaro? Because we know those characters. You know, why do we still love Carmen? We know those characters. And so it's that whole amazing ability of great librettists and great composers to create characters who still speak to us, or who can speak to us without being, you know, necessarily in that exact situation. And that's why I think it's, you know, creating a sound and the words of a character that make a contemporary work have a life. And I know we all strive for that when we're producing these works, and having produced many of them now. And I also think there's a pragmatic side for listeners who are out there who may not be working in the industry. You know, you have to create works that are responsible to produce, that are, you know, within a financial envelope, or that are within an envelope that you know that a certain part of your subscriber base are going to respond to. And that doesn't mean talking down to an audience, but it means, you know, we're a service industry. Why not, you know, engage with your audience in a way that hopefully they're going to speak back to you. So, and I know everyone here has had such a different experience in producing works.
And I see a lot of nodding heads in agreement there. So I'll bow out for now and turn it back to you.
Those were great questions, Mark. Thank you. We invited everyone to choose 2 lines if there was a second thing that spoke to you. And I'm wondering, Peggy, did you have a second thing that was appealing to you about this statement?
I did not choose a second one. However, I stuck with one. But I think the final line is extremely powerful about, we had better become positive and not just stand by. We had better do that. And I see that as a very strong encouragement. And I think it takes a lot of courage to not just stand by, and to let other people take the risks, and to take a safe route with, you know, whether it be producing or repertoire, or taking a chance on a young artist or creator. That staying positive about what they can offer all of us, and not just stand by, be the one that sticks their neck out, I think.
David, did you choose a second one?
One did not really stick out to me.
No. Okay, anybody else?
Nadege.
Sure, yeah. It was actually the pair of, you know, we're not custodians of the old order, and we must be oriented towards the future. But I realize I'm really focused on that future piece, because I think about the question that raises to me when I see that phrase is, whose future? You know, who is the person or the people or the group or the cultures that we're focused on in that future? And you know, this comes back based a little bit on what's happening right now, but you know, COVID-19 is really exacerbating and amplifying inequities that have long existed in our society, you know, racial and economic inequities, and they're really sort of amplifying those problems. And so when I think about what does the future look like, you know, whose future are we talking about? Is this an opportunity for opera companies, opera trustees to really dig in and make sure that we are being sort of and by the communities that we're serving? Because it's not enough to say we put XYZ on the stage and come because it's great. But the reality is, if people don't see themselves in the work, then they won't see themselves as part of that future. And I know that there's a lot of interest right now in thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think in this time of crisis, it's really easy to pick that up and put it away and think we've got to focus on other things. We've got budgets, we've got people to pay, but the reality is that has never been more critical. You know, as companies are making tough decisions and thinking about who is going to lead in this transition to get us to that future, you know, perhaps you are having to make, you know, unfortunate, you know, reductions. Perhaps you're having to think about those things. Who gets left in the room? Whose voice is a part of shaping how these companies are going to operate when we are at the other side of this? Who's on those boards and who's thinking about, you know, what opera is, what it has been, and maybe what it should be when we get to this, you know, new normal. I don't even want to say normal because frankly, personally, I don't want to go back to normal. Normal doesn't work for people who look like me. Normal doesn't work for a lot of people. So when we get to this new normal, you know, who is a part of that? And so, you know, one of the things when I see that phrase is, I hope that people are still giving space and importance to those critical issues as they think sort of in this crisis place. You know, at our board meeting just a couple of weeks ago, we spent almost the entirety of the meeting doing an equity and diversity exercise as a board, working with a consultant, thinking about issues of anti-oppression and anti-Blackness. I know that you say those phrases and you don't think opera right away, but the reality is art is life and life is art. And so if those things aren't a part of the way that we're thinking about conducting business going forward, creating art going forward, and engaging audiences going forward, that statement feels less powerful to me.
Thank you so much for that. Whose future are we talking about? That's really profound. Anyone else choose a second statement? Yeah, Francesca.
I didn't choose a second statement. I just, I want to kind of piggyback on what Nadege was saying, because of course we don't know what the next normal is or what the new world is going to be. But I do think what's great, particularly when I see, Nadege, that you're the chair of the board, it is so important. You know, I have been working, one of the reasons I started running a company was I was sick and tired of a world that did not have equal space for casting of all colors and kinds, that did not have creative teams that were, that did not represent our society and did not speak in voices. I feel very fortunate. You know, I have to give a shout out to David because he hired me very early in my career. And I think that in running a company, I try really hard to make sure that on stage represents what the world looks like, and that all the teams who create things are really representative of the world. And one of the hardest things is board building. And I think that that is, for all of us who run companies, is getting people on the board who are supporting these ideas and who represent America. And that is going to be the trickiest thing, because the board has an enormous power in what opera will be going forward. The same way that, you know, it used to be the press had so much power. The press certainly has power now, but now so much more power lies in the internet and how we perceive the world. And so I think it's just crucial that all these key positions of power, I mean, I'm even thrilled, you know, we're sitting here and we're seeing all these women on the screen. You know, there were so many years where you didn't see that. And so I know I'm stating things that we hear, but we have to keep reminding ourselves of it. And that for us to be relevant, we have to be able to speak to as many voices as possible. And I think that that's, you know, part of our collective job. And I clearly think that Glynn Ross, he was thinking that when he said all these things, he just perhaps didn't, you know, he wasn't in the mindset that we're in now, and an awareness of our culture. And I thought it was great when Mark said, you know, Vietnam just ended, and just all these things, you know, America in its own tumult at that time.
Exactly. Jimmy.
Yes, I wanted to comment on both issues, because the issue of diversity, I think, is very important. And I think that connects to what Francesca was saying before, creating an American canon. And what an American canon looks like now, or will look like in the future, is very different from what people 30 years ago might have had. but it will be nonetheless an American canon. And I think it's important to embrace that diversity at all levels. Once we see, that the creative, the creatives being as diverse as our audiences and as those who lead the opera companies and as those who review as well. Because there is somewhat lack of diversity also in terms of music critics and all that. But once we have diversity at all levels, I think we will have a better and wealthier kind of American canon. We'll inherit that. And there was something else I wanted to comment about the question that was posed to Mark before, and that was about what what the new opera should include, or what new work should include to be accessible in a way, or to reach people. And I felt, for me, there have always been two things that are apparently irreconcilable, and that is that we need to deal with what Carl Jung called the archetypes and the collective unconscious, meaning that we need to tap into things that are fundamental to all of humanity, as most opera does: life and death and love and betrayal and faith. But we also need to be able to speak to the zeitgeist, meaning that whatever we are writing to has to connect with us at this moment in time. So once we combine those two elements, where we are able to see our current reality through the lens of those archetypes that have been present with humanity since the very beginning, then we have the right ingredients to create a work of art that is durable, but that is also current.
Thank you so much for that. Mark, I see your back, so that means we have some more questions.
And it fits right in here, because people are talking about making opera accessible to newcomers. And I left it out of my introduction of Glynn, but when he was at Seattle Opera in many of those early decades, they did half the performance in each opera, they did an English version. So they did it in the original language and in English. And it's interesting how the introduction of projected translations in the 1980s eliminated a lot of performances that were in English, but Glynn had performances in English and performances in the original language as a point of accessibility. There was a question for Peggy, and this is one where currently, in a way, performances are stalled. We're not producing right now, but how are you moving your company forward through this period of external suspension?
I came to terms with the fact that any decision I make could not be the right decision. There's just not enough solid information to feel 100% confident in any decision that myself and the board and the staff make right now. However, I feel a strong responsibility to be decisive. And I have made decisions about next season, pretty radical change to what I once anticipated. The season being, we haven't announced it yet, but I feel that the decisions that we're making together are, in a strange way, adding a bit of security for us, because we have a clear direction. I know so many companies have contingency A, contingency B, contingency C, as do our budgets, but going forward, that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm also thinking, I'm terrified by this digital platform thing. It's not what I do. I understand all the fun, different ways to produce, but this threw me for a loop, this idea. And I don't, just because it's not my thing and I don't know about it, doesn't mean I shouldn't pursue it. And we are experimenting, and at the very least, we will come out with a lot of knowledge, and hopefully that we can build on for the future, because as hard and as challenging as this is, it is like forcing us into the decisions that were on the back burner, or the projects were too risky, now become elemental to our existence. So I think that's good. So I'm just trying to stay open yet decisive. right now.
A great question popped up about the fact that you're admitting that you're not a digital native, that the digital medium does not come naturally. That's not how you trained. That's not your skill set. And Cheska, I suspect that you are also not a digital native. And Jimmy, even you compose for an orchestra, for an opera company. And again, you are not practiced in creating digital work. So just curious about, and Nadege, in a way, the board of Minnesota Opera isn't equipped to make decisions around a digital medium. How are you adjusting? How are you gaining the access to expertise in order to begin to make decisions, aesthetic or managerial, in this new digital medium?
Talking to a lot of people who are younger. I mean, basically, you think anybody, I mean, anybody who's like 30 and under grew up with something in their hand, which was that was their reality. And I think, you know, obviously a place like Glimmerglass, where in the summer we'll have about 100 people who are in their 20s, that's their world. And so I find here and in Washington, I am turning very much to younger staff to feed ideas and to have, you know, I believe in, for management, I believe in dialogue with everybody. I mean, the buck may stop here, but, you know, I've got to get everybody's viewpoint. And I find that I'm extremely fortunate to have so many people who are conversant in this and who are helpful at explaining it. And I think anyone who's a parent, I have an 11-year-old who's upstairs going to school digitally, who just came down and fixed the printer for me before we started in like 2 seconds and said, I can't believe you couldn't fix that. So I think that learning about it is one thing technically, but it's also understanding the possibilities. And I think none of us have a full grasp on what those possibilities are yet. Sure, we're seeing everybody in their living room sing and all that, which is great, but it is going to be, how do we eventually create for this platform in a way that has the human connection, which is the reason that we all love making music and we love the acoustic voice. So I think just turning to people who have something to offer to me is probably the best way to start out.
Does anybody else want to speak to the digital question? Jimmy?
Yes, just briefly, you know, one thing that I realized is that some organizations were ahead of others when all of this came, because some of them had actually started to put online content prior to the crisis, and others were taken, you know, were unprepared in that sense. I think this stresses the importance of live streams, of having, you know, opera companies really having their content available. Like I am every weekend now tuning into the Met, and I love, they have a very extensive library. Of course, it's a very wealthy organization, and not all opera companies have that luxury, but I think in the future, it is important to think of increasing that for each opera company to create its own library of content for each orchestra. Some of American orchestras in general are behind European orchestras for contractual reasons, it might be, but many of the European orchestras have a vast array of concerts at your disposal online, whereas here, for example, I was composing residence at a Houston Symphony, and they only gave it their first try last September, very successfully, but it was the first time they were doing that. So I feel that nowadays we live in a world that is interconnected, and we should stress that, and we should strive to have our content available as well.
Thanks so much for that. Anyone else want to dip their toe into the digital question before we wrap up? Well, okay, please, Nadege.
You know, just thinking about this from a management perspective, we're really spending a lot of time thinking about how do we build the relationship amongst board members, because the reality is there are some tough decisions ahead of us as a board, as sort of strategic leaders of an organization. And if you feel disconnected from your peers when that time comes, how do you do that? And we've had the good fortune of having now a couple of board meetings via Zoom, just based on the way our schedule aligned. And each one we're getting sort of a little bit better. but thinking about ways to insert moments where people just talk to each other, not about the agenda, not about, whatever it is, because those are going to be super important as we continue to navigate this. And I'm not going to pretend we know what we're doing. I'm stealing from other boards that I'm on. I'm stealing from the foundation that I work on. Anytime, I think board members see something that works, they throw it in the mix and we give it a try. So I think right now it's about being sort of flexible and adaptable. And Peggy, you had made a comment earlier about sort of making decisions. I think we're kind of at that point. I mean, if you say, I'm going to wait for the universe to give me the information, it's not doing that right now. And so I think we have to just make decisions, but also give ourselves the space and grace to pivot on those decisions or to retract them when we get new and better and different information.
Terrific. Well, I think our time has passed, and my final assignments here are to thank you all very, very much. It's been so interesting, and I admire you all. And also to introduce our final bit of this. And Mark, are we a go?
We are.
Okay. So my final job, besides thanking you from the bottom of my heart, is to introduce the board chair of Opera America and the general director of Washington National Opera, Tim O'Leary, my neighbor. So Tim, take it away.
Hello, can you hear me?
There you are.
Hello, friends. I hope that my children don't interrupt the proceedings. Hold on, is my video not on? Can you see me now?
We cannot see you.
Yes, we can. I see you now.
Hello.
There he is.
Okay. I want to thank Francesca and Tazewell, who we didn't get to hear from, and Nadege and Jimmy and Peggy and David for an extraordinary conversation. This is Opera America's 50th conference, and we had planned an incredibly fun 50th anniversary as a fitting celebration of our art form and our people. This time is not exactly fun. We are all in a kind of grief mode, grieving for people that we have lost, also grieving for all the plans that we have made that are so beautiful that we will not get to fulfill in the way we had imagined them. And we are all staring down now with determination, the truly frightening uncertainty about how and when we will be able to gather again and to create and sing and connect in person. It's been so beautiful to see all these colleagues of mine and just think about last year when we were all together in person. I am aching for it myself. One thing, though, I know, having worked in the opera business for 23 years, is that this is a group of professionals and visionaries who will find a way. We will do it. Opera America is an organization that has also seen a lot of what it has planned disappear in the last several weeks. But there is a lot that Opera America has already built in place of what we planned. In 8 weeks, Opera America has organized now more than 150 video conferences and engagements and webinars with 5,000 members involved. Our field has actually never been in such close communication, so unified in our feeling of common purpose, and so informed about what is happening across our industry. For artists and opera companies, we are in, we should admit, a kind of existential danger at the moment, but there is opportunity at the same time, and I've been so grateful to all of you on the panel for pointing out the opportunities. The financial cost to our field, we estimate at already more than $100 million in lost earned revenue so far. This translates directly into lost livelihood for our artists and staff members. And yet the doors have been flung wide open to think differently. Experimentation with media at an unprecedented rate, totally rethinking, as Peggy mentioned, our seasons and our repertoire and our venues. I think Nadege said it beautifully about the need to deliver on civic value and partnerships in a way that we already knew was fundamental to our future, but now we see so much more clearly as the mandate of all of us in our field. I am so grateful to Francesca for her partnership in reimagining the future of this art form that she has helped build into what it is. Human beings have a need to tell stories, to connect, and to make music together as a source of connection. That will remain. So I want to salute every one of you who has taken the time to tune in. And as Opera America board chair, I want to take a moment to express gratitude to the incredible staff of Opera America, which is inspiring in its work ethic in normal times and in its excellence, and has been doubly inspiring, I should say, during this period. So leading that staff and offering always a tremendous example of dauntlessness and intelligence and cool-headedness and an unshakable commitment to art and to a better future is Opera America's president and CEO, Mark Skorka. So I turn it back to you, Mark, to close us out.
Well, Tim, thank you for your kind words, and I'll thank the staff in just a second, but I did want to give Tazewell the last word. So we couldn't hear Tazewell on the session, but he did write something, and I'd like to read it. It says that the line that spoke to him from Glynn Ross was that we must become positive and not just stand by. He says we must be courageous. Courage in the wake of so much divisiveness in our country at this moment. Courage and acceptance and saluting and celebrating our differences and how our points of view can unite us once again as a community. Standing by and allowing some autocrat to define us and appeal to our dark side will not and must not be tolerated. We need our songwriters and our poets more today than ever before. We need new songs and new stories that remind us of how we accomplish so much when we are together, when we are singing the same chorale from the same hymnal. So that is Tazewell's contribution to our conversation, and I'm so glad we could let him get his words in, even though technology wasn't allowing us to do it as much as we would have hoped. In terms of thanks, I want to echo what Tim said to get ready for our session today and for all of the video conferences and webinars. The staff have been working as a team, of course, remotely. Today, I want to thank Sarah Carter, Noel Deutsch, who've been sort of our stage managers for today, Emma Storm, who's been managing the YouTube feed, Laura Lee Everett coordinating from behind the scenes, Dan Cooperman and his team promoting this, the entire Opera America staff. But I'd also like to draw your attention to what comes next and what is next week in our 4-week installment at our annual conference by Zoom. So on Monday, the 18th at 2 o'clock, we will have a lead presentation from guest speaker Doug McLennan of Arts Journal. His lead presentation will take place on Monday at 2 o'clock, but then it will be repeated on Wednesday, the 20th at 1:15 before a panel discussion that begins at 2 o'clock talking about new technologies in their impact. So you see it on the slide, the lead presentation, Monday, May 18 at 2, a replay of the lead presentation on Wednesday, the 20th, and then the panel discussion and questions and answers at 2 o'clock on the 20th. But coming up next, and that's this coming Friday, we are going to have a toast to 50 years. It would have been the day that we had our 50th anniversary party in Seattle. We won't be together for it, but we're going to take 30 minutes together to make a few toasts. We have a good bit of news and we have a wonderful work of art to share with you. So please join us on Friday, 4:30 p.m. Eastern for a toast to 50 years. So with that, I echo Anne's thanks to all of our panelists. I thank Anne Meier Baker. Tim, thank you for being with us. And to everyone who's watching, we really appreciate it. Have a good rest of week.